Start, as I have been starting, with a brief recap of where we left off. And since Odysseus has a lot of travels, I thought a slide might actually be helpful today. So when we last met, Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, had just asked Odysseus to tell him who he is, where he came from, and where he's going. Now, in books 9 through 12, we pick up with Odysseus's narrative of just that. So his time from the moment he left Troy up until when he washes up on Scheria's shores. And I admit that this was actually a little challenging to boil down to a summary because Odysseus's own process of selecting information is actually really important. So, caveat that this is actually only part of the story, perhaps more than other times. He begins in book 9 in the main narrative frame by giving his own name to the Phaeacian court. We then enter his own narrative, and we learn that when he left Troy, he lays waste to the Cicones, he stops off in the land of the Lotus Eaters, and then he arrives on the island of the Cyclopes. There, he and his men search the island, and they find a cave that's filled with sheep and baskets of milk and cheese. They're amazed by this. And this cave turns out to belong to a cyclops named Polyphemus, who's the son of Poseidon. When Polyphemus returns, he traps the men in the cave and, with some measure of delight, makes meals of Odysseus's comrades. Odysseus is able to devise the trick to blind Polyphemus so that he and his companions are able to escape. In book 10, Odysseus travels from Iolia to the land of the Lycurgonians, finally to the goddess Circe's island. There, Circe transforms a group of Odysseus's men into swine by mixing sinister drugs into a drink she gives them. Odysseus, with the help of Hermes, is able to resist the effects of these drugs, and she actually ends up wanting him to become her husband instead. Odysseus is able to convince her to change his men back into their mortal form, and they all stay there for a year. When they prepare to depart, Circe tells Odysseus that he is not, in fact, going home just yet, but that he needs to go to the underworld. And Odysseus and his companions reach the underworld in book 11. They slaughter sheep, and to the blood come flocking shades of the dead. Odysseus is approached by Elpenor, who just died on Circe's island and is seeking proper burial, by Tiresias, the seer, who prophesies Odysseus's homecoming and, what's more, his death, and by his own mother, who Odysseus learns has actually died out of longing for him. Then a series of heroines come forward, and Odysseus questions each in turn. And he actually tries to stop the story there, but Alcinous urges him to continue, to tell him whether he saw any heroes. So Odysseus goes on, describing how he met Agamemnon, Achilles, Ajax, and Heracles before leaving the underworld. In book 12, Odysseus and his comrades return to Circe's island to bury Elpenor, and they set sail once again following Circe's advice. And with it, they're able to make it past the Siren safely, but they lose 6 men to Scylla and Charybdis. They put in at the island of Thrinacia, where the sun god Helios keeps his cattle. Though Odysseus warns his men not to eat these cattle, they disobey him and sacrifice them while he's asleep. So, when they set sail again, Zeus destroys their ship, and together with it, all of Odysseus's remaining companions. Odysseus, alone, holding onto stray ship planks, drifts in the sea until he reaches Calypso's island, where we found him when the poem began. His narrative ends there. So we have a lot of juicy, plot-rich books to discuss tonight, and we're really lucky because we have not just one, but actually 2 faculty members here to discuss it with us, Professors Kim Shelton and Grace Erny, and it's my pleasure to introduce them both to you now. Kim Shelton is the class of 1957 Garth B. Wilson Professor of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies and the director of the Nemea Center for Classical Archaeology. She is the author of several books and articles on her specialties in the political economy, religion, and ceramic industry of the Aegean Bronze Age. She's a dirt archaeologist who directs 3 ongoing projects in Greece, including Cal's excavation at the Sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea, where she spends her summers doing research and training students. Also, Kim has worked at the Bronze Age site of Mycenae for 3.5 decades. Here at Cal, she teaches classes in Greek archaeology and culture, including mythology. Grace Erny is assistant professor of ancient Greek and Roman studies. Her research focuses on archaeology and history of Greece and the Aegean in the first millennium BCE. She has conducted fieldwork in multiple regions in Greece, on Cyprus, and in the American Southwest. Her current book project investigates economic inequality, social differentiation, and rural communities on the Mediterranean island of Crete. And she has published on the role of Crete in the Homeric epics. She's currently reading books 6 and 9 in Greek, 6 and 9 of the Odyssey in Greek with her intermediate Greek language class this semester here at Berkeley. So thank you both for being here. I turn over the floor to you. I know we have a lot to discuss. Let me stop sharing so that you can take it away.
Great. I don't know who wants to go first. Grace, do you want to start out and answer some of the questions? Or should we?
Sure.
Does
Yeah,
that
I
sound
can
good?
answer some of the questions and then hand
And
it back to
I may
you
jump in with a bit here and there. Yeah.
and transition to book 9.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for submitting these questions in advance. And one of the questions, Kathy asks, could you say something about the poeticity of the verses in Greek for those of us non-Hellenists, and how the translation does or does not reflect the original rhythms, sonority, alliteration, assonance, etc., and images or symbols? So thank you, Kathy, for this great question. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to talk a little bit about this. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Great. So one of the things that, I think really repays reading Homer in the original Greek is that, of course, Homer is writing poetry. And he's writing metered poetry. So a lot of us are probably familiar with iambic pentameter, right? In English, this is a meter that Shakespeare uses in his sonnets and in his plays. And it's based on stressed and unstressed syllables. So iambic pentameter, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So like sonnets, right? My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, right? So we have this kind of idea in our head of English meter. So in English, this meter is based on stressed and unstressed syllables. But in Greek, um, long and short syllables are made up of whether there are long or short vowel sounds in each syllable. So it's all based around the quantity or the sound of the vowels. And as people were performing this oral poetry of Homer and other what we call early hexameter poetry in archaic Greece, they would actually have held the long vowels out for twice as long as the short vowels. And so Homer's meter is really important to how this poetry would have sounded to its original Greek audience. And Homer's meter is what's called dactylic hexameter. Hex means 6 in Greek, so it means there's 6 feet or little sections in every line. And each foot is what's called a dactyl, long, short, short, or a spondy, which is 2 long syllables. And dactyl actually comes from the Greek word daktylos. If you hold up your finger, daktylos means finger. You have 1 long joint and 2 short ones. Bum, bum, bum. So a line of hexameter that's all dactyls sounds like this. Bum, 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 bum. Now, if you're in a Greek class learning Homer, you would learn how to write out these long and short syllables on every single line. And this long and short syllables, they actually have an effect when you're reading the poetry. So I want to just show you an example from book 9 to sort of show how the meter can contribute to the way that poetry sounds and the way the poet paints images with words. So I have on the top of the slide the original Homeric Greek. This is from a section in book 9 about the land of the lotus eaters. So just as a recap, Cecily mentioned this in the beginning. One of the places that Odysseus lands with his men is the land of the lotus eaters, located by later Greek authors like the historian Herodotus, probably in North Africa, in Libya. Um, so Odysseus is being blown all around the kind of Western Mediterranean and Southern Mediterranean at this point. And remember that he sends out men to explore the country. They come upon the lotus eaters, and the lotus eaters feed them this fruit that they eat. And whoever eats this fruit forgets about going home and just wants to stay in the land of the lotus eaters, eating the fruit all the time. So Mandelson's translation renders this section when Odysseus is about to leave the land of the lotus eaters, tying the men who have eaten the lotus to the benches of the ship to get them to go. He says, in English, "Then I gave this command to the rest of my loyal comrades. Time to step lively now and get aboard our speedy ship." So no one would eat the lotus and forget about coming home. Now, the Greek renders this actually a little bit differently, and I put the Greek on the top of the slide. Mendelssohn has Odysseus speak to the men directly, right? We have a quotation from Odysseus's mouth. In the Greek, it's more indirect. So I commanded the others, the trusty companions, rushing to board the swift ships. And then we get this last line. And I want you to listen to how the line sounds when we read it in meter. It uses a lot of spondies, a lot of long syllables. Me pos tis lo toio fagono stoio la thetai. Notice all of those long spondies in the beginning. This is really serious, right? This threat that the men might eat the lotus and forget about coming home. And the other thing that I really want you to notice in this line, you don't have to read Greek to sort of see this structure. You'll see lotoio, lotus, phagon, eating. Nostoio. Notice that it rhymes. It's in the same case, the genitive case, as lotoio. Lotoio is lotus. Nostoio is nostos, homecoming, the sort of central theme of the Odyssey. Lathetai, our last verb, forget, right? So we have this interweaving where the lotus and the nostos are opposed, right? If you eat the lotus, you'll forget your homecoming. And that's really woven into the Greek that it's a little bit hard to see that in the English. So that's just one quick example of how the Greek, really gives us something that is hard to capture even in a really good translation like Mendelssohn's. Really quickly before I hand it over to Kim, I just wanted to address the second question that we had, which I think will feed into what Kim has to say. And this question is, I was from Gwyn. I was surprised to find that the main actions I'd always associated with the Odyssey take place within Odysseus's narrative. To me, this distances the action from the reader or the listener. Is there significance to this narrative within the narrative? Great question. Why fold all of these amazing adventures of Odysseus into a sort of frame in the land of the Phaeacians? Why don't we get this narrated from Homer himself? Like you guys have read books 1 through 8. That's all narrated by the poet. 9 through 12, Odysseus steps in and becomes the narrator. And I think we can kind of see the answer to this in the very beginning of book 9. So if we go back to the very beginning of book 9, as Cecily said, Alcinous has just invited Odysseus to tell his story, and Odysseus begins his speech with a little preface. Alcinous, my lord, distinguished above all people. A fine thing it is indeed to listen to a bard such as this one here. Remember, they've just heard the bard Demodocus sing a bunch of songs, whose voice sounds like a god's. For I myself will say that no occasion brings more delight than this. Whenever good cheer takes hold over all the land, as people feast in their halls, listening to a bard, sitting there each in his place, eating and drinking, right? This goes on and on. And so I think what one of the things that Homer is doing here is he's giving himself a little bit of a compliment, right? He's saying there's nothing better than to listen to an oral poet telling stories. And interestingly, Odysseus here also is giving himself a bit of a compliment, right? He says that he's talking about Demodocus, the bard that they just all heard. but he's about to tell a story in poetic meter for the next four books. And so he's kind of signaling to his audience, I'm an extremely skilled oral poet. Can't wait to hear, I'm sure you can't wait to hear me talk for the next four books. And this also allows him to be really selective and careful about what he reveals to his audience. And so we always have to remember when we're reading 9 through 12, we're getting this filtered through um, Odysseus, right? We're not getting this from the poet, the poetic narrator himself. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Kim to talk about the Cyclops.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I would just add to that as well that it to some what Gwyn asks about it also being kind of buried in the middle, like why isn't this the first thing we hear? And I think many people would agree that this is the most exciting part of the story and the one that comes away that people remember, even from elementary school. They still kind of remember this part of the poem. And that just means Homer's whole plan of how he arranged this story worked. That was sort of his whole plan. That he one of the most interesting things about the story is, of course, that it starts in the middle of everything, and it doesn't. You don't start at the beginning and then work through chronologically. That you're starting in the middle. It heightens the adventure. It heightens the unknown, and then Odysseus has to build his own character and his own attempt at self-recognition before he's going to be able to get home. So this is a way where we've gone basically we're going to end up halfway through, and he's finally able to truly reveal himself and tell his version of his story, which in addition to letting other people know who he is and emphasizing his craftiness and his intellect and his ability to be an oral poet, as well as everything else that Odysseus is so well known for doing, it also allows him to kind of acknowledge himself. He's coming to terms with what he's done and where he's been and what he's been through. And so by recounting his tale, he's also on a journey of self-discovery, and he's revealing even to himself, I can talk about this now. And that so that we end in book 12 with the moment that he's ready to go home. This all had to happen, but it happens in this. First, we have the middle, then we have the beginning, then we're going to have the end. And it just makes for a much more interesting story in a lot of ways and reveals so much about his character. And we know that one of the things that's so important about Odysseus's journey from the battlefield of Troy to his home life, to his family, is a transformation that many go through, even that we know today, from the sense of the battlefield and the heights of violence and tragedy to the home and hearth and family that is supposed to be totally removed from that. And for him, he has this long extended time to do it, and yet his personal discovery is very slow. And one of the things that has to transform is he instinctively leaving Troy, and based on that, on his experiences there, he is the warrior Odysseus. And he immediately, when confronted with adversity, he draws his sword. And he has to learn that, in fact, that's not actually going to always be the right way to go, that he needs to be able to recognize his intellect, his craftiness, and his ability to get out of situations without drawing his sword. And through the progression of the story, he comes to that self-discovery through trial and error. And of course, one of the ways that we see this happen starts already in book 9. And I want to actually share my screen, and I'm going to show something similar to what Cecily showed us. Let me bring this up. And this shows us, let's see, yes. This shows us the same thing as Cecily did, but vertically instead of horizontally. And it's just sort of to set us on the right path, because we're on a journey through this along with Odysseus. This is a remarkably well-crafted part of the story, both on Homer's part and Odysseus's part, if we bring those two together, and the way that we have the different episodes across the three books are in a very interesting composition where we have essentially two parallel sets of four activities, four scenes, with one that is kind of a ring composition where you have with Circe, and then you have Elpenor, and then you go, the katabasis is the descent into the underworld, and then back to Elpenor, back to Circe. So you have this whole circle, and then that's flanked on either side by these other sets of adventures. And those, interestingly, they alternate between non-violent and violent ones. So that it's non-violent and then violent and non-violent and then violent. So you have that too, this back and forth, and there's even structured ways talking about the poetic version of the story, that there are stock phrases that introduce each of the scenes, and the only variation you get is when has been a violent scene that came before, you get an added line about the companions that were lost and how sad that is. So that brings that together. I was hoping to see my presenter view so I could pop into this, but let me just go through this real fast. I'm sorry about that, because I want to show you the Cyclops. So this is maybe one my favorite part, one of my favorite parts of the story. And it's very much, I think, a favorite because of the fact that it feels like an impossible adventure, that it's truly in the land of myth, the land of the unbelievable. The fact that he and his companions are confronted with this giant monster with a single eye. And this is an early interpretation of that story that we hear in the epic. And we get actually the recounting of a number of important themes from the whole poem happen in this one scene. And that includes the fact that Odysseus has the instinct to fight before he, of course, then rights himself and shows a bit of growth already, that once he and the companions are trapped in the cave, if they just outright kill the Cyclops, they're trapped and they will surely die as well. They won't be able to get out. So he has to hatch a plan. He has to use his trickery to come up with a way to save himself and his companions, even though the companions are being eaten left and right. And that's another important theme of the overall story, is what in Greek we call xenia. And in English, we would translate that as maybe the guest host relationship. And it's this agreement among civilized groups that you go through. There's a certain way that you host guests without being violent or doing anything awful to them. And in fact, you take care of their needs, like feeding them and dressing them and bathing them, before you would then ask them, probing questions or anything like that. And we've seen already through the poem a number of good examples of that, including when Telemachus visits Pylos and he visits Sparta, and we see the exemplar of what a xenia is supposed to be like, including the host giving gifts to the visitors that he can take away important luxury gifts. Now, the Cyclops, we find out immediately, is not a civilized group. He's not a civilized being. We're told by Odysseus just some of the things that they don't have. They don't have a government. They don't have council. They're all individually ruled themselves. They don't know about crafts. They don't know about shipbuilding. So those are all signals that we're dealing here with a different group, not part of civilization, which means danger. They should be on alert because of all these signals. If they hadn't figured it out already, of course, the Cyclops does not welcome them into his cave and treat their creature comforts, or find out if they need to be fed. He, in fact, eats them to start out. So he literally reverses Xenia. He does all the wrong things. He eats some of the companions. He asks them all these probing questions. He's rude. He's awful. He's not the things that the Greek poets are telling us are a civilized signs of civilization. So that's another interesting thing to see in this part of the poem. And it also has, I'm thinking about things that we learn through reading it in Greek that we don't always get in the English translations, even the best translations. Grace mentioned, obviously the structure of the poem and the meter and all of that. Vocabulary is another place where, in many instances, the Greek word is much more specific than what we can use in English. Xenia is a good example. It's this very complex give and take kind of relationship that's all encapsulated in a single word. And we can't really do it. It can mean guest, it can mean host, it can mean stranger, it can mean the relationship between those individuals. Greek does it in one word, and we understand the complexity in that. Another fun one that comes out of this great tale is when Odysseus is using his wits, but sometimes they also get the better of him. And that's, of course, when he's asked what his name is. And if he's not going to reveal who he is, of course. And he uses this trick of saying that he's nobody or no one. And that's what then when the Cyclops is screaming and the other Cyclopes come to ask him if what's happening to him, and he says, "No one is killing me or no one is hurting me." And they're like, "Well, why are you yelling then if no one is hurting you?" But there's this other interesting part of it because they use the word outis in Greek, which technically means nobody, but it's an unusual form that usually in Greek you would find the word metis or metis, which means not anyone. I'm not anyone, metis. And that is almost a homophone for the word metis, which means wisdom. And so there's this play on words between the nobody, the trickery that's involved, and the wisdom that is also coming out of that same turn of phrase. So it's kind of a fun thing that again, English can't do it. It only really works in the Greek. So that's a fun part of it. And of course, coming out of that um, scene we find out that once he's blinded the Cyclops, Polyphemus, who's I guess is a little ironic, he's the very famous, is what his name means, and yet that seems to be against what the Cyclopes actually how they live and what they do. But we of course find out he's the son of Poseidon, so that makes him perhaps more famous than others. And we see this, getting him drunk definitely uncivilized because you drink wine, but you don't get drunk in Greek culture. That's different. So the idea that he's not used to drinking, even though it's very special, strong wine, they get him very drunk and then are able to blind him. But he goes on, of course, functioning, even though he's blind. But this is how they're going to be able to sneak out of the cave once the Cyclops himself moves the big stone from the cave. And I also then want to share this lovely vase, which is from around the same time that's produced in the archaic period, where the epics are really circulating. The Homeric epics are really very popular at this time, and we see that playing out in art. The scenes from these stories suddenly show up all over, especially vase paintings, but also in architectural painting and sculpture and things like that as well. So this seems to be could only be really the scene of Odysseus and his men escaping from the cave, hidden underneath the sheep. And so even as Polyphemus is blind and he's trying to feel if anyone's sneaking out and he's only feeling the sheep, he of course doesn't feel them underneath and know that the men have strapped themselves underneath so that they can sneak out from the cave. So they do escape, and it shows the importance of his intellect and his trickery and using his mind rather than his weapons. And yet he has not made the full transition. He still doesn't really understand, the importance of his different types of identities and the different ways he identifies himself because he can't help but really revealing who he is once he gets just far enough away that the Cyclops, of course, is hurling stones as their ships and almost hits them, but they're able to escape, and he has to yell back and identify himself by his name, and that he identifies himself as the sacker of cities, not as a smart man, but as the sacker of cities. And he's the one, and he even tells the name of his father. So he's easily identifiable. He's not just any Odysseus. He's the Odysseus, son of Laertes, and says that he's from Ithaca. And those are the important ways that even Greeks in the later historical period identified themselves with a personal name, the genitive of their father's name, and then the place where they come from, their home village or hometown, or in Athens, your home deme. So he does that so everyone would know, and especially Polyphemus. And this allows the wrath of Poseidon to be called upon, and then will inflict all of the things that the sea and Poseidon inflicts on Odysseus and his men going forward. And I just want to contrast that with later on when he has learned his lesson and he identifies himself in this case to the Phaeacians when he says, I'm Odysseus, son of Laertes. All men watch out for my trickery, and my fame reaches heaven. I dwell in dusty Ithaca. So it shows in that same, he does actually the first one before he does the second one. So it shows that level of transformation, which is such an important part going forward. Grace, do you want to take over for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kim.
I'll unshare.
Yeah, perfect. So just one thing to add to what Professor Shelton was saying. Another thing that we can kind of get from the Greek in the Cyclopes episode. So I was just reading book 9 with my class, actually right before this in Greek, and we are in the beginning of book 9 still. And Kim mentioned how the Cyclopes are characterized by Homer in book 9. They don't have ships. That's one really important thing that they don't have. Everything in their land grows without them having to sow or plant. So in a way, it's this very, if we think about Odysseus as this kind of this is also like a period where Greeks are moving around the Mediterranean and settling new colonies around the Mediterranean, especially in South Italy and Sicily, which is seen as the kind of home of the Cyclopes. That's where this part of Odysseus's travels were located. But one of the adjectives in Greek that Odysseus uses to describe the Cyclopes is huperphialos, which is again a word that's a little bit hard to translate in English, but it's huper is something that's above or beyond. So sometimes people translate this as overweening, which is kind of old-fashioned sounding, or arrogant. And huperphialos, this is the same word that's used of the suitors back in Ithaca, right? But if you think about it, right, Odysseus is trying to craft this narrative to make the Cyclopes out to be huperphialos. But who in book 9 is actually behaving the way that the suitors behave in Ithaca? It's Odysseus and his men, right? They enter Polyphemus's home without asking. They're eating all of his food, which is exactly what the suitors are doing back in Ithaca, right? It's repeatedly described as they're eating his house. Basically, they're eating everything in his house and impoverishing him. So I think that, I saw a couple of comments about is everything Odysseus tells us reliable? Maybe not, but I think we still get these little glimmers that come through, right? We can sort of see the poet messing with us a little bit, right? Odysseus describes the Cyclopes as huperphialoi, but in doing so, the poet's also inviting us to see Odysseus's behavior as huperphialoi, right? By using the same word. So I think that's another thing that's kind of interesting. Odysseus is also violating laws of Xenia, one of which, by the way, is also telling your host your real name, which he does not. He says his name is nobody. So he's violated this rule as well. So yeah, basically book 9 is a tale of Xenia gone horribly, horribly wrong. Um, But I wanted to talk a little bit about book 11. So going back to Professor Shelton's lovely ring structure at the beginning, you have these four events, right? And then you have book 11 sort of right in the middle. And this is sometimes called the katabasis, the Greek word for going down. And sometimes the word for this book in Greek is also the nikia, the entry of Odysseus into the underworld. And one question that I sort of wanted to pose to all of you and think through, and maybe you can continue discussing afterwards, is actually why does Odysseus have to go to the underworld? Why include this episode? If we think back to the way that the narrative is structured, in book 10, Kirke tells Odysseus, you have to go to the underworld. You have to, right, dig the trench, slaughter the animals, fend off all of the ghosts from the blood until you question the prophet Tiresias, and he will tell you what to do next. So Odysseus does all this. He gets the advice from Tiresias. Tiresias warns him not to allow his men to drink the blood of the, or sorry, to kill and eat the cattle of the sun, which we know that in book 12 they will in fact do, and this will mean the destruction of the entire crew except for Odysseus himself. But then in book 12, when Odysseus actually gets back to Kirke's island, um, Kirke tells him again exactly what Tiresias just told him. By the way, I'm going to tell you, don't eat the cattle of the sun, because if you do that, you'll lose all your companions and come home by yourself very late. So if Kirke already knows this information, what's the function of sending Odysseus to the underworld in the first place? And I think we can think about this in sort of what does book 11, as Professor Shelton was saying, if books 9 through 12 show us in some sense the development of Odysseus's character, what does book 11 reveal to us about who Odysseus is, and what does it do for him as a character in the story? Um, so I'm sure that people have their own ideas about this that they could continue to talk about, but I wanted to just present a couple of ideas and observations. And I saw actually a question, which I was really happy to see, about the heroes and the women, the spirits of the women who come forward in the beginning of book 11. So I'm going to get to that as well. Um, so one of the things that I think that book 11 does is that it actually gives us the story of what will happen to Odysseus at the very end of his life, right? So one of the other things that Tiresias tells Odysseus, in addition to telling him, don't eat the cattle of the sun, right? He gives him this sort of practical advice. But then he sort of fast forwards to what will happen after the epic is over. And he says, what you need to do after you've gotten home and taken care of the situation there, you need to take an oar in your hand and walk as far as you can inland until you get to a place where nobody has any ships and nobody's ever tasted salt and nobody knows about the sea. And I think if you think about, the role of the sea in the Odyssey and the role of the sea for the Greeks in general, right? No place in Greece is very far from the sea. This is the furthest geographical location that a Greek can conceptualize, is a place that's so far from the sea that nobody makes ships and nobody's even seen an oar before, right? So Tiresias says, take this oar in your hand. And when you walk to a place where nobody's even seen an oar and everyone thinks that what you have in your hand is a winnowing fan. And if you guys have ever seen like traditional agriculture in practice, a winnowing fan is like it sort of looks like an oar, but it's a pole with a big flat thing on the end. And you throw grain in the air so that the chaff, the part that's not good to eat from the grains, separates and flies away, and you have the grain left to eat, right? So people who only grow grain, but they have no idea what a ship is, plant your oar there, and then you can come back, and then you can die, right? So what does this mean, right? I think people have interpreted this in a number of different ways. One idea is that what's caused Odysseus's problems is that Poseidon is very, very angry at him, right? Poseidon is always sort of contriving his demise over the course of the first few parts of the books. So by telling him to go to a place where no one knows about Poseidon and plant a symbol of Poseidon there and then return, this is supposed to kind of placate the god Poseidon, right? So I think that's one thing that the underworld story does is it gives us a glimpse of Odysseus's life beyond the end of the epic, right? And what will happen to him at his death. And we get little glimpses of Odysseus's youth later, right? When he's talking to Penelope, as you'll see when you read, when he returns to, we'll learn how he got his name and these things that he suffered in his childhood before the epic began. But we get something about the epic's end and how Odysseus's own end will come, right? So that's one thing I think Book 11 does for us. Another thing I think Book 11 shows us for Odysseus's character is that it gives us a glimpse of Odysseus for the first time, I think, in the epic, actually reckoning with the consequences of his actions, right? So Odysseus meets quite a few people in the underworld. One of them is his mother, Anticlea, who he doesn't know is dead, right? This is news to him. Odysseus goes to the underworld and sees his dead mother and speaks to her and learns that she's died because of his absence, basically, from grief because he's gone. And she tells him, I didn't get sick. I didn't die of old age. I died because you are absent. And I think this is, one of the first times that Odysseus actually has to reckon with what has happened back at home because of his absence. And another example is he also at the end meets many other characters from the Trojan War, including Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ajax. And here again, he also has to sort of reckon with how he's behaved in his past during the Trojan War, right? So Ajax and Odysseus in Greek myth famously have a quarrel over who gets Achilles' armor. And Ajax doesn't get it and goes mad and commits suicide. And this is a direct result of kind of Odysseus's grasping nature, right? And so Odysseus says, I saw Ajax, this ghost, and I felt so bad that we had quarreled, right? And this is like a very rare thing for Odysseus to actually reflect on mistakes that he's made. And another thing that I think we really see in this interaction in the underworld is kind of opposing ideas of what a hero should be. So for those of you who have read the Iliad, the central hero in the Iliad is Achilles, right? Odysseus is the central hero of the Odyssey. And these two heroes represent totally opposite poles, right? Achilles' whole thing in the Iliad is that he wants to have a brief but glorious life. He actually says at one point, I could go home to Greece and I could live to a ripe old age and die in my native land and be unknown. But what's important for me is to die in a glorious way and have kleos aphthiton in Greek, undying kleos, undying fame. So Achilles is a sort of proponent of a brief but glorious life. Odysseus, totally the opposite, right? Odysseus is someone who will do whatever it takes to stay alive, right? He's a survivor. And really, the Odyssey is a story of how he manages to survive all of these different things, sometimes by behaving very ingloriously, right? By using sneaky tricks, by shooting bows and arrows, right? All of these tricks that we see Odysseus employ during his struggle to stay alive. And so I think this confrontation between Achilles and Odysseus in the underworld is actually a kind of conversation about different sets of heroic values, right? Achilles actually kind of seems to concede something to Odysseus because he says, being dead is terrible. I would rather be a slave. The word in Greek is thes, a bondsman, in the land of the living than be the greatest hero the Greeks ever knew, but be dead, right? So I think we also get this kind of discussion in the land of the dead about these different kinds of heroism and heroics, and this sort of tension between an Odysseus type hero, a wily, crafty survivor, and an Achilles type hero, who's, the best fighter that's ever been, who would prefer this sort of short, glorious life to a long one. One other thing that I think is really interesting about Book 11 is that we get this reminder in the middle of Book 11 that Odysseus is talking. So somebody in the comments mentioned this sort of this catalog of women that Odysseus sees. And these are all women who are the mothers of heroes. So they're women who have had liaisons with gods and have given birth to demigods. This is really interesting as a kind of, you know, side like episode in the Odyssey, because we always have to remember that the world of archaic Greek poetry had many, many different poems floating around. And we know that the poet Hesiod, who is also an oral poet working probably a little bit later than Homer, but part of the same kind of poetic culture, actually had a poem called The Catalog of Women that was about these women, right? These women who had liaisons with gods and gave birth to heroes. So we kind of get a sense that there's snatches of different poems that are floating around being incorporated into the Odyssey here. But it's right after this discussion with these about these women that Odysseus breaks off his narrative, and he's like, "Okay, it's time to go to bed. You know, that it's time. I'm done talking now." And then we get this really interesting exchange where the Phaeacian queen, Arete, speaks and says, No, 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 you should keep going. And then her husband, Alcinous, sort of takes over and is like, I'm in charge in this house, and I'm going to tell Odysseus to keep going. And that's the hinge point in book 11. So we get this discussion of all the women, Odysseus's mother, and then we get this break in the middle. And then the rest of the poem, after Alcinous sort of takes over the conversation, is about the men, right? It's Agamemnon, who says a lot of really misogynistic things, right? Because he hates his wife who killed him. It's Achilles and Ajax, right? So we get this kind of break where even the book itself is almost split into a female and a male half. And again, some of you were talking about, is Odysseus reliable? Well, I think Odysseus is playing to his audience, right? His audience breaks in here. Alcinous is like, I'd like to establish dominance. And then Odysseus is like, okay, let me talk about the men now. So he's really playing to the audience. And I think that interruption is meaningful because to us, we've been sort of lulled into this story. And then all of a sudden we remember, oh, yeah, Odysseus is crafting this story very carefully. And you know, there's this kind of break in the center of 11. Um, there's a lot we could talk about the Odyssey all day, but I think we're getting close to time. So I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to add, Kim, or share.
I would just add one thing, leading off of what you were saying, that the interaction with Agamemnon also serves another purpose because it again reminds us that Odysseus is trying to get home to his wife. And although he's assumed that everything will be fine and dandy and Penelope will be happy to see him, he now learns about what's happened to Agamemnon when he came home. And a very different story from a very strong woman, very vilified by Homer and all of the Greeks, but someone who actually's character should probably be redeemed for a lot of reasons, but happens to also be Penelope's cousin. The two of them were related and were cousins. And so that even heightens this, like, whoa, maybe this is in fact going to be more dangerous than I imagine. And it again reminds us, just as the Phaeacian break reminds us that we're in Phaeacia and then he's telling this story, it also then helps to remind us, oh yeah, and he has to get home. Like we need to resolve that. It brings that again to the fore. And so that's really what book 12 does. I mean, it has some of the most interesting characters and all of this adventure and all of this danger. And it does two things. It fast forwards everything beyond all of this long time that he's with Calypso, so that when he does return home, it feels like we're in the present. You know, we haven't missed that much time. Brings it all to the fore, and it also gets rid of all the rest of the companions because, in truth, Odysseus has to go home by himself. He does, even though they're warning him what he needs to do. Fate has really decided that he has to do it on his own, and that of course, this is what these last few adventures in 12 happen is they all have to, clean everybody up, get all the players, the day players off of the stage, and allow him to be the star of our show from then on.
Totally. And yeah, absolutely. I think the Agamemnon parallel is so important. And I'm sure Professor Kirk probably mentioned this but if you think back to the very beginning of the Odyssey, right? Zeus is thinking about the story of Agamemnon, Aegisthus, and Clytemnestra, right? So this is haunting the narrative from the very beginning. Will Odysseus's homecoming look like Agamemnon's? Will Penelope end up being a Clytemnestra? Will she marry one of the suitors and try to kill Odysseus when he returns? And then, of course, Orestes in the story of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra then turns around and kills his mother, right? It's this horrible chain of events. Will Telemachus have to take on this role, right? Will he have to like then engage in this endless cycle of violence? And as you'll see when you read the end of the Odyssey, it's a very different story what happens back on Ithaca, and the cycle of violence is cut off by Athena before it can progress further. Um, so yeah, that kind of parallel alternate universe is haunting the whole story from book 1 to book 24. And book 11 is another example where Agamemnon's actually there, narrating what happened to him. So yeah. Thanks, Kim. This was really awesome. Thank you all for being here. It's fantastic that there's so many people.
Thank you both. I think, someone said something similar in the chat, but it's just really cool to hear you both kind of bounce off of each other. I think there have been a lot of resonances between what you're each drawing out. Um, Before we go to breakout rooms, I know Renee just had another brief announcement.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to hop on at the end and say thank you so much. You guys turned out for this. We met both the ancient Greek and Roman studies match and the archaeological research facilities match, and it
Yay.
is truly because of you. We had a long way to go in both of those, and we're going to be they just were really successful, and it's because of the people in this room. So please know that we really, really, really appreciate everything that you do and for spending your evenings with us. And thank you so much to Professor Shelton and Professor Erny for sharing, for volunteering your time, and for sharing expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and let me just say too, thank you. Our programs and our students especially, thank you, because this will all
Definitely.
go to benefit their experiences, and that's so very important. And you can tell we're very passionate about this subject matter, so it's been a joy for us as well.
Thank you both so much for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you in a few weeks' time for our next session. And yeah, join a breakout room, hang out, discuss further. Thanks for joining us.